And welcome to BRC and Friends. It's a regular-ish 30-minute Google Hangout with me, Bruce Reyes-Chow, where I chat with friends and adventurers from around the interwebs. Today, I welcome the Reverend Dr. Marcia Mount Shoop.
Hello, it's
Hey,
great to be here.
good to have you. Marcia is a theologian, author, preacher, teacher, blogger, mother, middle school cross-country coach, football coach's wife, caretaker of several animals. I couldn't even do it in one breath. Animals on their small farm. She has her PhD in religious studies from Emory University, and I've known Marcia for a while. I did not know this. In 1991, as a cross-country rock star, apparently, was named Kentucky's Woman of the Year, and as one of the 10 national finalists for the NCAA Woman of the Year. She's the author of Let the Bones Dance, Embodiment of the Body of Christ from Westminster John Knox Press. And recently, which we'll talk about today, is the author of Touchdowns for Jesus and Other Signs of the Apocalypse, Lifting the Veil on Big Time Sports. Wow, Marcia is a slacker. Gosh, I wish you would actually have done something with your life. Before we jump in, though, I want you to make sure everybody checks out the links below. I've put them all in the stuff below this, below the video, and feel free to tweet along with us if you're watching this live, or if you're watching it later, you can get to us at B Reyes-Chow or M Mount Shoop. That's MMOUNTSHOOP, and use the hashtag BRC and Friends. As usual, our time is broken up into 3 segments. The first I'll center around the interests and passions, expertise of our guests. The second around a couple current events or two. And lastly, I ask a few questions that were developed by my family and kids. So we'll see how that goes. Welcome again, Marcia. Glad to have you. I'm going to flip the camera over to you now. You wrote this book, and I've had a chance to read it, and I really, really love it, and the links are below, everyone, so you can see that and pick that up. But let me just ask you generally a couple questions. How did this come about? When did you decide, okay, I'm going to write a book about what seems like a lot of stuff that people don't want to know or don't know or haven't thought about big-time sports? How did it kind of say, okay, I'm going to do it?
Well, it's been kind of percolating for several years. John and I, my husband and I, started doing some talks about sports and religion several years ago, and people really enjoyed it and kept saying, "Oh, you should write a book." And I thought about it and said, yeah, I'll do that. But then when everything happened at the University of North Carolina with the NCAA football investigation, and our learning curve about some things in big-time college football was very steep and very painful, the whole project took on a different feel to me, and it became what I've said before is a moral imperative, and I really thought I needed to write it, and I had to write it. So that was in 2011, 2012. In the midst of that, we moved, but I really started working on it in 2011, 12, around then.
Have you received any backlash? I know one of the things you talked about in there is that folks are like, should you do this? Is this going to be bad for John? You know, are you airing dirty laundry? I mean, I'm sure there's inside or outside stuff. Have you received any pushback or flack from folks within the community?
Oh, sure. I mean, that's part of it. That's part of doing anything that matters. You know that. You know.
Right.
And of course, it remains to be seen what effect it would have as far as John's career and things like that goes. But definitely we've gotten the message from a few different quadrants that it would have been better if I had not made this decision.
It would have been better if you didn't do it, basically.
Right, exactly.
Like, just reading it, I could imagine, I'm sitting there going, man, like, well, the first thing I want to talk about is kind of faith. You know, I mean, you talk about being kicked out of a Bible study for suggesting that you should read different versions of the Bible. I mean, I would be intimidated by having a person who has a PhD in religious studies to join any Bible study I was leading. But, you know, I'm the stereotype, true or not, and you've mentioned a couple folks or a couple times in the book, just to kind of this from our perspective, being, for lack of a better word, kind of progressive-ish or
Mm-hmm.
mainline Christians,
Mm-hmm.
that's not the prevalent kind of perspective of faith that's in the locker rooms.
Mm-hmm.
How Talk about that a little bit. I mean, you say there isn't really room for a lot of diversity in that. How did
Mm-hmm.
you see that? Is that changing? I mean, what do we do? I mean, talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think one of the things I talk about in my chapter on Christianity and big time sports is that there really is a monopoly of a certain model of Christianity. And that's not, I don't say that is good or bad. I'm not saying it's good or bad. That's just a fact. And that is because of the diligence and hard work that groups like Fellowship of Christian Athletes, Campus Crusade for Christ, InterVarsity, those groups have done the work to build the relationships, to get out there and really make sports a platform for what they're doing. And you can see the payoff of that for them. And so there is a prevalence of a particular interpretation of Christianity that tends to focus on things like, the necessity of Christianity for salvation, a particular kind of model of how we witness to Christ. In other words, every chance you have, if you're interviewed on TV, or if you make a touchdown or a big catch, use that as a chance to glorify God and to say what you believe.
Right.
So that's very deeply entrenched into the world of big time sports. And interestingly enough, progressive Christianity has really kind of been like, who cares?
Mm-hmm.
That's just something they do over there, and really sports has not that much to do with religion. And so, kind of more progressive Christians have just sort of ceded that whole landscape to another way of understanding Christianity. So when somebody like me and John and others who may have a different way of practicing our faith intersect with that world, it's hard to find your place. It's hard to know where you fit. And I think one of the things that has made me kind of marginal in that conversation is also my gender. Because often a particular interpretation of Christianity and particular understandings of the way gender and church leadership go together kind of can get grouped together. And I know some groups like FCA are trying hard to kind of expand their understanding of leadership in the church to include women more. But, and plus add on to that, football is pretty well male dominated. So it's kind of like a perfect storm,
Right.
and we've been swirling around in that for over 20 years, so.
Well, we'll talk a little bit about this more in your chapter on Man Up, but you talked a little bit about the chapter. I love that. Unlike some other sports where like basketball or soccer or some others where women are making some headways because they're playing more, or they're the football, that's just not a reality. Like that piece, like there isn't the alternative to football for women to kind of get into that. So that I find that gender divide, the things you talk about, really interesting. And like, how do you get over that? I mean, are there any female chaplains in the NFL or in college ranks? I mean, I'm sure some. Oh, really?
No, I've never met one.
Maybe a guest one. I'm just going to assume that somebody has been a guest chaplain.
Well, I think I said somewhere, I don't remember if I put this in the book or not, but John's been doing this for almost 25 years, and until a few days ago, I have never been invited to lead a chapel service.
Really?
And just a few days ago, Coach Daryl Hazel, the head coach at Purdue, asked me to come and do a chapel service for the team.
Woo!
So that was the first time I broke through.
You broke through.
It was lots of fun.
I almost want to have you back on. I mean, I mean that could such a mate, like, because they probably know they're going to respect you at a certain level because they know John, and
Mhm.
and now
Mhm.
you're there, you're bringing these credentials in, and it'll be
Mhm.
really interesting to see what their reaction is to you. Are you
Yeah.
hopefully, if it makes sense, if you can blog about it, I would love to share
Yeah.
that with folks. I think
Sure. I'll do
it's
that.
fascinating. But that would be interesting to see if there have even been guest chaplains brought in
Mhm.
for folks. But okay, so let's get back to the progressive thing. So do you think, folks have asked me, I'm a big sports fan. I'm a big Oakland A's fan,
Mhm.
49ers fan. Folks said, well, you should go be a chaplain for one of those. Um, do you think there's room for progressive, like, is that something that would be welcomed? Do you think that there
Hmm.
really is room for that? Is that shifting? I know you talk about blurring lines around gender and other
Mhm.
things, social. I mean, do you think that there is a space so that we're not just abdicating this kind of huge influence in
Right.
society? I mean, what do you think about that? Is that worth something, putting some energy into?
I think it's an awesome idea. I mean, I have found that there are a lot of spaces where people are hungry and open for some different ways of doing things, and um, I also think that it's time. I mean, our culture is one where we need to honor difference in some new ways. And the sports world, in some ways, can be out in front of culture, but I think sometimes it can also lag a little bit behind culture because there's a certain conformity to the way you do things in the sports world. You got to be a good soldier
Hmm.
and make it work. Um, but I do think the players who are playing now, they've grown up in a different world, and so they hunger for that. They want that. They want places where they can wonder about things and grow, um and they want places where they can hear some differences of opinion too. That's just the world they've come up in. So I think it's a great idea. You'd be a great chaplain. Go for it.
I agree. I think I'd be an awesome chaplain too. If anybody's in the Oakland A's hearing that, no. Uh, or if you need a new shortstop, that's always been my dream.
Okay, you
You
can
know,
double a
I'm
double.
sure. I'm sure they need a 5'5", 45-year-old shortstop with a bum shoulder to
Yeah.
play shortstop these
Well,
days.
who doesn't? Who
Yeah,
doesn't need that?
who doesn't need that? So let's talk. We kind of moved around, but let's want to talk about your chapter on race because as you know, I write about that a lot and talk about that a
Yeah.
lot, and it's constantly, obviously, everyone in the world. I think there are fewer and fewer people that are saying we're post-racial or we're beyond anything, and
Yeah.
um, I'm going to include it afterwards a link. There's a great post written by a colleague of ours, Patrick Laney,
Oh.
called "When White Men Can Jump," and he writes this beautiful post in light of the Atlanta Hawks things that have been going on around
Oh.
race and privilege in basketball that we were seeing.
Cool.
So I think lots of great stuff going on. You talk a little bit. I mean, you really push folks to dive deep into the race conversation, though, in this chapter. Not just, I mean, about privilege and all that. And I just want to read one little part here. That you say when you look at the way you look at race, that fact that the majority of these revenue-producing unpaid athletes are black is of a particular interest. It's not that just so happens to be that way reality that many whites would like to think it is. The apocalypse of sports and race does not show us as symbols of access and equality. This apocalypse reveals marks of our most chronic patterns of racially divided inequity in America.
Mm-hmm.
Those are pretty strong. I mean, that flesh that out for those of us that don't want to think about it, or like, what does that mean
Mm-hmm.
when you're challenging how the sport looks in terms of race?
Well, I think sometimes there's a kind of mirage effect with sports that we look at it, and when by we, I mean sort of, you know, probably your typical kind of moderate sports fan. It could be anybody. It doesn't just have to be somebody who's obsessed with sports, but we sort of mildly gaze in that direction and think, well, sports is equal access. in other words, you're judged on your ability level, and actually probably people of color might have an advantage there, because we have these unspoken assumptions that, you know, certain kinds of bodies are better at certain kinds of sports. Actually, biology tells us that there is no biological basis for race, so there can't be an advantage for certain racialized groups based on race in certain sports.
Right.
So the first thing I try to do is to say, let's surface some of these assumptions about race and advantage for certain groups in sports. And then let's look at what's actually happening in sports, and all the scandals we hear about, and all the problems that we hear about, and the laments that we hear about. And let's look at what's actually happening with the framework of race. And you see that there's clear disadvantage, especially for young black men in revenue sports. And that gets expressed in lots of ways. In terms of how they can benefit from their labor, in terms of the quality of education that they get, in terms of their opportunities after they've played, and just the way we take care of them if they're injured and things like that. There are levels of disadvantage that vividly reflect some of the ways race plays out in our larger culture that we like to ignore too, in our criminal justice system, in our education system, and everything from real estate to employment to salary levels. We'd rather not look at that stuff. And sports kind of shows it in clear relief if you're willing to use race as a lens. It's pretty clear, and that's why I felt very authorized, I'll say, to use that strong language about race. I feel very strongly about that. Probably that chapter and the higher education chapter are the ones I'm most passionate about after what we saw happen at UNC.
Right. Yeah, as that chapter, I don't know which one will people get more angry at, or could have potential for, wrangling the most feathers. I mean, I think that chapter really, because it seems everything is so financially driven, and so there's this kind of commodity that's placed upon humanity, that if you really take a good look at this, it is really painful to see. I mean, it's just kind of the extent at which which things actually go on. And in a lot of our communities, we talk about this. In San Francisco, we're a predominantly Asian American community. As we think about sports and our girls and all that, and kind of the images they have. Whether I've seen my friends who are African American, my girls' friends, and people immediately talk to them about scholarships because they're good athletes. And this kind of, and my African American parents are like, why? And I remember one of them calling a parent and said, well, why do you think that's the only way my child's going to go to college?
Going to go to college, yeah.
It's like, it was one of those like, yep. And it started that, and again, it was not malicious. It was just, here's what came out, and they knew that this girl's a great student. It was really interesting, and and in fact, she's a good player, but wasn't the best player on the team. And so it's like, wow, there you go. And then it's such a deeply embedded system and culture. So how do folks begin to have meaningful conversations about this to begin to shift that? Does that begin with a university, an AD? Does it begin earlier than? Where does? It's probably all of it, but who kind of starts that? How does this change?
It's tough. It's tough because there's a very tenacious narrative in place, and when it comes to revenue athletes, and especially young black men, that narrative is, and people don't want to admit this, but I hear it all the time. they should just be thankful to be here because they're getting a scholarship to go to school. That's what they should just be grateful, you know. And the next part of that sentence is, and they should know how to act.
Yeah. Well.
And that has been so, I can't count the number of times that has been expressed to me about football players. And these guys are like our family. I mean, let me tell you something. There's some of the most amazing, wonderful people on the planet. They're complicated individuals just like everybody. But I'll tell you who's grateful. We are. We're grateful to have them in our lives. We're grateful to know them. We're grateful for all their hard work and effort and for the stories that they bring with them. I mean, they add so much to the community. And so I think, honestly, Bruce, where it starts is people have to be able to build real relationships with actual people instead of having these easy caricatures that they fall back on for how they make decisions. So athletic directors, boards of trustees, presidents, the NCAA, and their member institutions have to find a way for players themselves to be more substantively involved in the way decisions are made. Because I firmly believe those one-on-one relationships, the face-to-face relationships, will do the most harm to these caricatures than anybody can. I can write it until I'm blue in the face. But until somebody has a personal experience, and players have really been left out of the decisions that affect them the most. And, you know, John's constantly off asking faculty members and people to come sit in his meetings, come and get to know the players, and very few people take him up on that. It's like there's just this divide. So it's like a lot of things. If we can actually create communities where people can actually hear one another, then I think that's how things will change.
Right.
Now, from the other end of things, the marketing end, this is a market machine. So when there's bad PR, when there's bad press, like there has been, there's pressure coming from the other end to change. So I think if we can kind of keep pressing from both ends, at some point we're going to meet in the middle, and then the real change will happen that needs to happen.
Right. Thank you. There's really no good segue into the next thing, but obviously this week we've been barraged with the Ray Rice and Janae Rice video and hearing all this. Now will say that I am not going to watch the video. Have not watched it. I kind of sit in that circle that she doesn't need to have that out there, and I'm not a big fan of TMZ anyway. At the same time, it's raised lots of the sports radio station I listen to has been talking about this, and I think it's been really interesting to hear them struggle through this. Some of them are very articulate. Other ones are like, oh no, I have to deal with actual moral thought. It's been very interesting. So I've been really impressed with some of our DJs. I'm like, man, this is why I like you. And then these other athletes are kind of like, why are we still talking about this? But it's great. But there's lots of it. But just what are your thoughts on how this has been handled? Just from kind of an insider's world. I mean, what were some of the things that you've been thinking about over the past few days around this?
Well, for years I've had a lot of pain and difficulty around this issue, just with our culture at large. But the way that women are objectified and sexualized and diminished in the world of revenue sports is, it's acute. It's big time. So I've been feeling an extension of the same things I've been feeling for years, that it's the result of, again, this very caricatured world that big time sports is, where women have very little access to the life in and out of the life there, with any sense of power or agency. And so wives, I'm one of those wives.
Right.
We kind of hover around the margins, and when and we have no privacy, and I think Janae is saying that really. She's like, this is my business. But the thing is, in big time sports, there's no such thing as privacy.
Right.
And so that's one of the places where you feel helpless and you feel like you can't really control what's out there. The domestic violence piece is one in which I think, like you said, okay, the awareness is raised, people are talking about it, that's a good thing, I guess. But it re-victimizes every single one of us who've had an experience of sexual violence or domestic violence. Every time I read, kind of a string of comments about how stupid she is to stay with him, or how they should ban him for life and everything, it's like the complicated truth of domestic violence is in there somewhere, and I'm not naive enough to think that this, that video or Ray Rice is going to change a culture in the NFL around the way women are treated and understood.
Right.
Again, if they've got pressure coming from the marketing end of things, which they do because of the video, they're going to do what they think they need to do. What I'm praying for, and I'm going to try to somehow express this to the powers that be if I can, is that they would really look at some of the root causes and start to address those, not in the public eye, but in-house with a little bit more intention.
Right.
And I pray for Janae and Ray Rice just like I do for everybody that has violence in their intimate relationships. It's a very difficult, excruciating reality.
Right. Thank you. That's very helpful. I mean, I think part of it is just trying to figure out what are words to put around all of this. That's actually very, very helpful. I want to flip to something that's positive, I guess. We laugh because we know what we're going to talk about next. So my family, especially my girls, I'm raising 3 daughters, and we are hooked on this show called American Ninja Warrior, which I don't know if anybody has ever seen, but it's comes out of Japan, and the Americans, of course, have taken it on and blah, blah, blah. But, it's this obstacle course where they, when you look at it as an amateur, it's like, why can't they do that? That doesn't look that hard. And then you watch them try to do it, and it's crazy. But my girls got hooked when they saw Casey Catanzaro, this 5 foot
Catanzaro.
5'2". I don't know how old she, but conquered
awesome.
the wall. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're both our family. We don't have a lot of time. Our both families are both big Ninja fans. How did you all get into the show?
Oh, well, my son, my 14-year-old son unearthed this and became obsessed with it. Then my 10-year-old daughter got in on it, and she too saw Katie Catanzaro and was like, she's awesome.
Yeah.
Now my husband and I are hooked on it, so.
I will say there have been a couple times, it's I have to remind you, it's still marketing, it's still TV, where they've had like the rapping preacher, and they give them all these. I'm like, oh, good Lord, please stop. And everybody has a backstory, and it's kind of fun to anyway. Okay, so there's our American Ninja Warrior.
I will add one little story. Like, we were watching the other day, and it was some big thing. I can't remember what it was. And the guy finally did it. He was the only one to do it. And my daughter looked over at me, and she goes, "Mom, are you crying?" And I'm like, "Yes, I am." That was just so emotional.
He had 4 kids, raising them by himself. Yeah.
Oh, goodness.
I know, it's crazy. It's crazy. All right, so we're at the end of our time, but I have some questions for you
Yeah.
that are just random. You do not have to go into a long explanation. These are just kind of, think actor's studio kind of thing. All right, you could have
Okay.
one song played when you leave your house for everybody to hear. It's your walkout music. What song would it be?
You know that song, "Oh, Come With Me Now." Dun, 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 dun. I don't even know all the words, but it fires me
Just
up.
go. That's just going on. All right, good. All right, what smell reminds you most of your childhood?
A pot roast
Oh,
cooking.
there you go.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. A ticket arrives in the mail today, and it's a round trip, all expenses paid for 1 month for you
Mm.
and John. You're not bringing the kids. Where are you going?
Sunset Beach, North Carolina.
Really? All right.
Yeah.
There you go. Okay. Favorite political figure? Alive, dead, whatever.
Jesus Christ.
All right. He was political? No.
Yeah.
Sorry. All right. Paying it forward just a little bit. If you had one organization that more people should know about, what would it be?
I'm involved with the Student Athlete Human Rights Project, and it is a nonprofit project. There are a lot of academics, but other advocates involved in it, and anybody can get involved in it. And it really is to raise awareness and also to reach out from another quadrant to universities and the NCAA and other institutions when we see something happening that where student athletes' rights are denied. So we write letters, we call, we interface with universities and the NCAA and also pro teams and things like
Wow.
that.
That's
Yeah, pretty
that's
cool.
that is awesome.
Yeah,
That's
it's
great.
awesome.
Well, okay, we've reached our time. Thank you for hanging out with me a little bit today, Marcia. Glad you could be here.
It was awesome to be with you, Bruce. Thank you
Yeah,
so much for
you're
having me.
you're welcome. So, everyone else, thanks for tuning into this episode of BRC and Friends. Thanks again to Marcia for hanging out, and please take a moment to connect with us as well. Again, all the links are below. And so, until next time, keep talking because there are times when silence is not an option. Thanks for being with you, and we'll see you next show.